As a Broadway producer, ultimately, like many of you, I'm in the business of storytelling. That's what we do in the theater. Just a few blocks from here, tomorrow night at 7, tonight's Monday, there's no shows. But tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, right around here, you can see stories about the AIDS crisis or the Iraq War, or if you want something more fun, story about 3 drag queens getting on a big pink bus and going across Australia, as you wish. Because telling stories on Broadway is an incredibly risky endeavor, I'm always careful to stop before I begin and say, do I really want to tell this story? And if the answer is yes, then it's usually a question of making it happen, however that might be. But several years ago, I came across a set of questions that were far more difficult to answer. The questions weren't about the story, but they were rather about the storyteller. They were about ownership and identity, and ultimately the question of who gets to tell which stories. David, everything with the black play is political. That's what Jewel Nemiroff, the executor of Lorraine Hansberry's estate, used to tell me. You see, in 2004, I produced the first Broadway revival of Hansberry's classic American play, A Raisin in the Sun. I had first met Jewel 5 long years earlier in 1999 at a regional theater production of Raisin. She was a fierce African-American woman in her 70s who was really protective of Lorraine Hansberry's work. The production that night, it had a lot of flaws, but the play, it sang out. Lorraine Hansberry jumped out from 1959 and grabbed me, and it was a revelation. Raisin plays as if it was written this morning. The story is of the Youngers, an African-American family, and their struggle with what to do with an inheritance. It's all about family and dreams and race and gender and class, and it also has one of the best things the theater can offer, a great story. How will it end? Will the Youngers leave their south side of Chicago tenement and move into their beautiful new home in an all-white neighborhood? Or will the family be torn apart and squander the money? It's that perfect play that is so rare that combines social relevance and pure drama. The original production had starred Sidney Poitier and had been mounted in 1959, just 4 years after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on an Alabama bus. Today, Frank Rich and Robert Brustein and every major American critic recognizes Hansberry as having been an extraordinary playwright who penned one of the best American plays ever. Raisin is considered no less a classic than Death of a Salesman or Streetcar Named Desire. But in the 40 years since its maiden voyage on Broadway, it had never had a Broadway revival. What set it apart, I would come to see, is that it dealt with a black American family as opposed to a white American family, and that's why it had not consistently been produced like the others on the Great White Way. I acquired the rights from Jewel and set out on the journey. My first job was to hire a director. We decided there were 2 important qualifications for the job, Jewel and I. 1, they had to have real Broadway experience. Broadway, you need a director with a track record on Broadway because that's how you get stars, which is how you get your show on. The second qualification for the job was they had to be African American. The problem was there were literally 2 people in the entire world who fit this criteria. There are very, very few directors on Broadway who are not white men. Okay, so if we look at this is all the directors who had a show on Broadway 2 seasons ago. And as you can see, there's 36 directors, and there are 4 women, and there's 1 person of color. Sort of striking. So I went to the first director, and he passed. And so then I went to the second director, a guy whose name was Marion McClinton. His star was very, very high in New York at the time. He's incredibly talented, but he and I, we did not see eye to eye on anything. We had, as they say, artistic differences. We tried to cast the play together, but with no luck. Lawrence Fishburne, Angela Bassett, and Denzel Washington all came and went. Being a producer is like being a magician. You have to create the illusion for everyone that everything is moving forward all the time. But the truth is, I was really stuck. Everybody was saying, David, why do you even want to produce this play in the first place? I mean, white people would say it's a black play and that black people don't come to Broadway. And black people would say, David, this is a dated play. At some point, it just got so miserable with Marion that we parted ways. So I was in a jam because there was literally no one else to replace him with. So I began to present to Jewel for her approval numerous, very celebrated Tony Award-winning directors who happened to be white. And none of them would do, and we quickly found ourselves at an impasse. I argued that in the theater, we could tell each other stories. I always thought that was part of the point. I mean, Raisin's a naturalistic slice-of-life play. Hansberry describes on paper the set, the characters, the action in detail, and I argued if we listen carefully, sensitively to Lorraine, then how could you go wrong? I mean, artists are explorers. That's what they do. Why did the race of the director have to be paramount to everything? I mean, besides, the theater is the place of disbelief. I mean, Shakespeare's men played women, and Joe Patt pioneered colorblind casting in the 1970s, and Anna Devere Smith can portray 100 characters in an evening. So this whole thing didn't make much sense to me. I even tried arguing it from an evolutionary perspective, and believe me, I was stuck, so I would try anything. I mean, isn't it good for us to tell each other stories? I mean, doesn't it help us to maximize the dialogue? I mean, isn't it in the interest of the human race's survival that we tell stories? The story is what holds the information. Yes, the storyteller is important, but the information, that's the thing. Don't we have to share information so we know where the food is and which cave the bear lives in? But Jewel was having none of it. She clearly took a page out of August Wilson's book. Wilson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning African-American playwright, had famously declared his work could only be directed by black people. He wasn't an issue of affirmative action. He said, I am not carrying a banner for black directors. I think they should carry their own. I declined a white director, not on the basis of race, but on the basis of culture. White directors are not qualified for the job. The job requires someone who shares the specifics of the culture of black Americans. We have a different way of responding to the world. We have different ideas about religion, about style, about language. We have different aesthetics. We've heard these issues raised before. When Steven Spielberg set out to make the film of The Color Purple, Spike Lee said he can make a better film of Malcolm X because he was black. Right now, we actually see these issues being played out in the controversy around the Martin Luther King Memorial, which is finally being built in Washington, D.C. The committee decided that they wanted to build a 30-foot sculpture of Dr. King carved from stone. They ran headfirst into a huge controversy, however, when they announced they had chosen a Chinese sculptor to create the memorial. Some wondered, how could a Chinese artist possess the deep understanding to capture the nuances of an African American? The slope of the shoulders, the way he holds his lips, because it's in these details that we find the real truth. As one African American artist said plainly, they don't see us the way we see ourselves. But back to Raisin. It's been 4 years. I had no director, no star. I'd spent tens of thousands of dollars, and there was a real chance I was going to lose my rights. To hang on to my rights, I took a chance, and I hired a regional theater director named Kenny Leon. At the time, Kenny had one minor New York credit. It was a complete risk in every way, but Jewel would approve him, and I'd get to keep my rights, though how I'd get the show on, well, it was sort of a mystery. As it turned out, it was a good turn of events, because Kenny was a great collaborator, and we actually began to put the show together. We were able to assemble a cast, and we made the newspapers when we announced that Sean P. Diddy Combs, Puff Daddy, would be making his Broadway debut. Sanaa Lathan, Audra McDonald, and Felicia Rashad would join him. With this unexpected cast, we went into rehearsal. Raisin often runs over 3 hours. It shouldn't, but the directors, they lose sight of the action and the play goes on and on. So Kenny and I talked about making cuts in 2 particularly difficult scenes that productions historically had run into trouble with. And these scenes involve issues of assimilation and the Back to Africa movement, which was very in vogue in the 1950s when the play was written. When you got to these scenes, you could see the audience check out. So we decided we would make cuts in them. But as Kenny got into rehearsal, he became very excited about them. And he said that those scenes should stay because they were quite beautiful. When I expressed skepticism about this, he firmly and sensitively pointed out that I couldn't see it because I wasn't black, but he promised that I would in time. Each day when I went to rehearsal, just to check in, I could see something amazing was happening in the room. Kenny was uniting the cast in a way that I had never seen a director unite a cast. There was something like spiritual in the room, almost bordering on religious. And Kenny set the tone for the entire production, on stage and off. And when we got into when we got into performances, those two scenes, which had put audiences to sleep, they riveted audiences. And it was so clear that I had made a huge mistake. Because all those productions that I had seen where those exact scenes had not worked, they had been directed by white people. And the idea of hiring a white director now for A Raisin in the Sun seemed absurd. Raisin would succeed in drawing huge numbers of African Americans to the theater. I would say the audience was 80% black. There were families from Harlem and kids, hip-hop kids from downtown. For many, it was their very first time to a Broadway play ever. You have never heard so many cell phones and beepers in a theater in your life. But they were also incredibly engaged in the play, and the theater sounded like a Baptist church, with the audience vocally responding to every twist and turn in the play. The whole thing took on a life of its own. People came from all over the country. The last week of the run, people waited in line for up to 2 days and 2 nights to get a cancellation. Backstage, every night was crazy. There were movie stars and politicians and actors and athletes, but for me, the most memorable night was the night that Muhammad Ali arrived. I have never seen a group of famous people so excited about another famous person in my life. I went backstage, and everyone's running around, like the cast is running up and down the stairs, and Puffy grabs a picture he has of the champ off his dressing room wall, and he brings it down for the champ to sign. And I'm standing there with Kenny and with Jewel and with Puffy and with Muhammad Ali. And he says, Sean says, this is David. He's our producer. He spent 5 years working on this. No one wanted to be in the show. No one even understood why he wanted to do it. I say hello to the champ. And then there's this quiet and there's a stillness. As the champ reaches out his hand to touch my forearm. His hand shakes because he has Parkinson's, but he reaches out and he touches my forearm, and then he turns to Puffy and he says, he's a white boy, and everyone bursts into laughter. And in an instant, it hit me, like how improbable this whole thing was. Like, where was my place in this with Jewel and Kenny and Puffy and Muhammad Ali and Lorraine Hansberry? You see, the thing is, I feel a deep love and deep connection to this play. And I know that there are many other people who are not African American who feel that same passion. But still, I know that having an African American director for Raisin in the Sun was absolutely the right thing. Just like when I saw the movie Milk, I was so happy that gay people created Harvey Milk's story for the screen. So, in the end, where does that leave us? That only a woman should tell stories about women, or only a Muslim should tell stories about Muslims? Even after Raisin, that doesn't seem right either. August Wilson would probably say that Kenny's production succeeded on the basis of Kenny's culture, not Kenny's race. So it's about each African American director and what they would bring into the room. So if there was a black director from Beverly Hills, would he be as qualified as a black director from Chicago? And what if he was half black? And what if he was raised in Hawaii by his white mother? I mean, it's clearly about each person's identity and what they bring in. Just a couple years ago, Lincoln Center Theater produced the first Broadway revival of an August Wilson play since his death in 2005. The play is Joe Turner's Come and Gone, widely agreed to be Wilson's masterpiece. What was so striking about the announcement was the director, Bart Sher. Bart is incredibly accomplished and very, very talented. He's also white. It was really quite a shock considering how strongly we knew Wilson felt about all this. Still, the production was a huge success by all accounts. Theater people, notoriously difficult theater people, loved it. President Obama came in for a Sunday matinee with his family. But I couldn't help but think, was this right? And then I read an interview with the cast, and what they kept coming back to is what a great listener Bart was. From the smallest details to the largest decisions, there appeared to be a true dialogue going on. Bart, he understood and he acknowledged that he didn't know everything, so he looked to his cast for answers. I mean, in some ways, we could say this represents a lot of progress. But on the other hand, does it really take into consideration the very divided world that we still live in? I mean, just a few weeks after that production closed, Henry Louis Gates, the preeminent African-American scholar, was arrested for walking into his own home. So shouldn't we acknowledge the divide instead of pretending it's not there? You know, in this day and age of Uber communications and new technologies, the theater is generally thriving. And I think the reason for that is because the theater, like this today, is ultimately about community. And I want our communities to grow and to thrive and to become more inclusive. To do that, sometimes we have to tell each other stories. But there are other times when we have to be wise enough to sit back and truly listen. Thank you.